My name is Kasim. I am 28 years old, and on August 22nd, 2019, I stood on the marble balcony of my family's palace, believing that the sun rising over Riyadh that morning would be the last sunrise of my life. The sky looked too calm, almost indifferent, as if it had no concern for the storm unraveling inside my chest. I remember gripping the cold, golden railing, wondering how a single day could hold so much dread. Only hours earlier, my father, whose voice had shaped every rule I ever lived by, announced that I would marry my own sister to preserve our bloodline, a royal tradition sealed centuries before I was even born. Those words crashed into my mind like a stone thrown through stained glass, shattering everything I believed about duty, faith, and identity. I could barely process the weight of it. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the calm authority in my father's voice, the way he spoke as if he were announcing a diplomatic treaty and not the destruction of our humanity. My sister sat beside him in silence. Her face was pale, her body still, her eyes fixed on the floor as if she were trying to escape into the cracks between the marble tiles. In that moment, her silence told me everything she had known about this fate before I did. She had lived with that horror in her chest for months. She had already died inside, quietly, obediently, the way royal daughters are trained to break without making noise. Something inside me cracked. It was not rebellion yet. It was not courage. It was simply the unbearable realization that the faith I was raised to follow with absolute devotion had no room to save me from this. Every movement I made that morning felt heavy, as though my body were wading through water. My breath came out shallow. My palms were damp. I felt like I was drowning in a palace built on gold. Everything had been planned: the engagement ceremony, the signatures, the religious blessing, the celebration of purity disguised as honor. I was suffocating in a nightmare I could not wake from. The palace corridors, usually filled with polished serenity, felt like tunnels leading me toward a sentence I had no power to alter. I remember passing a mirror and seeing a version of myself I did not recognize, eyes hollow, skin drained of color, a prince in silk robes who looked more like a condemned prisoner awaiting execution. For a moment, I wondered if death would be easier than obedience. Have you ever faced a decision so impossible that even the darkest escape seems kinder than the path laid before you? That was the question echoing in my chest as the sun climbed higher above the city. I felt abandoned by the God I had served my entire life. I recited verses under my breath, trying to quiet the panic rising like a tide inside me, but every word fell flat, as if they were dissolving before they reached heaven. Standing on that balcony, I felt the world closing in. I thought that day would be the end of my life, either through death of the body or death of the soul. But something I could not see yet was already moving toward me. A crack was forming in the darkness. A whisper I had not yet heard was making its way into my despair. I had no idea that the God I had never truly known was about to rewrite everything I thought was final. I believed that day would destroy me, but Jesus was already preparing to save me. I was born into a world most people only ever see through television screens or luxury magazines, a world where marble floors stretched like frozen rivers through endless corridors, where Austrian chandeliers scattered diamonds of light across ceilings painted with verses and calligraphy so exquisite that artists and historians from across the world sought to study them. Servants moved quietly through these halls, their presence so efficient and so constant that I rarely lifted a finger for anything. Every moment of my childhood was cushioned by silk, gold, and the kind of privilege that convinces you nothing in life can ever harm you. But there is something they never tell you about privilege. It can be a cage far stronger than iron. A beautiful prison is still a prison, even when the walls shine. Some of my earliest memories are of standing beside my father during private religious lessons with scholars flown in from Cairo, Mecca, Istanbul, and sometimes even London men with long beards, scholarly eyes, and an air of certainty that made me believe everything they taught was unquestionable truth. They praised my recitation of the Quran with words like gifted, chosen, blessed. My father watched me with pride, nodding when I completed entire chapters without a single mistake. I learned quickly that my worth rested on performance, obedience, and the ability to impress those in power. I never asked myself whether I loved God or simply feared disappointing my father. In our world, obedience and faith were inseparable. By the age of 12, I had memorized the entire Quran. By 16, I spoke 4 languages: Arabic, English, French, and German, because father insisted a prince should converse with the world, not just rule his own nation. I learned diplomacy before I learned how to talk to girls, learned strategy before I learned how to laugh without checking who might be watching. Every lesson was meant to shape me into an heir of value, a polished jewel in the royal crown. People assume wealth erases loneliness, but loneliness inside a palace is sharper than loneliness anywhere else, because you are surrounded by thousands of eyes, yet none of them are allowed to truly see you. My sister and I were close when we were young, before the walls between male and female roles grew high, before tutors replaced playtime, before she was taught to lower her gaze and I was taught to speak as a leader. She was 3 years older, always bright, always laughing, always curious about everything, until the year she turned 17. Something changed in her, a quietness that seeped into her bones, a heaviness in her eyes. I asked her once what was wrong, but she only squeezed my hand gently and said, "Some things are easier to bear quietly." Back then I didn't understand. Today I wish I had pressed her harder. My mother, a soft-spoken woman with eyes that carried kindness even through layers of expectation, used to brush my hair when I was a child and whisper, "One day, Kasim, you will learn that the cost of being born into power is rarely paid in money." I never knew what she meant. When she died suddenly, quietly, with whispers of illness that never quite made sense, the palace grew colder. My father withdrew into duties and decisions. The scholars grew stricter, and the expectation on my shoulders grew heavier, as if my mother's absence created a vacuum that tradition rushed in to fill. I learned early that feelings were to be hidden. A prince did not cry. A prince did not show weakness. A prince did not question. And so I buried my questions deep beneath ritual and recitation, as if silence itself could keep my heart from wandering. Yet even surrounded by gold, I sometimes woke at night with the sense that something essential was missing. I would walk barefoot through the palace at dawn, the cold marble reminding me I was alive, the sky slowly shifting from black to pale orange, and I would ask myself, why does everything feel so perfect on the outside and so empty inside? But emptiness in a royal family is not a conversation, it is a shame, so I kept it hidden. Much of my youth was spent traveling between palaces in Riyadh, Jeddah, and abroad, hotels in Geneva, diplomatic houses in London, private islands where businessmen and princes spoke in circles of power and influence. I sat beside father during dinners where decisions were made that shaped the futures of thousands. Men toasted alliances I barely understood, and father would rest a hand on my shoulder, signaling that one day I would sit in his place, making choices that affected nations. "You must be strong," he told me once, as we stood overlooking the city lights of Dubai from the top floor of a skyscraper. "Our family is the spine of this kingdom. Without purity, without strength, without discipline, everything collapses." I nodded, not knowing the full meaning of his words, not knowing that purity in his mind meant something far darker than moral integrity. Even as expectations grew, I did my best to be the son he wanted. I prayed on schedule, studied late into the night, trained in leadership, memorized diplomatic scripts. People called me fortunate, blessed, destined. But destiny can feel like a collar around your neck when you have no say in its shape. The older I became, the more I noticed the cracks. How my sister's laughter vanished entirely. How certain rooms in the palace were always locked. How my father's conversations with elders ended abruptly when I entered, their expressions tightening. How decisions were made about my future without asking what I wanted. One evening, during a family gathering, an old counselor patted my father's shoulder and said, "Your sons will carry the lineage with honor. The blood will remain strong." My father smiled, and something in that smile unsettled me. Not pride, but certainty, determination. I didn't understand then. I was being prepared slowly, quietly, inevitably, for a fate that would break me. And deep inside, beneath years of recitation and duty, a question began to form. A forbidden, whispered question. Is this truly what God wants, or only what men want in His name? The shift did not happen all at once. It arrived slowly, like a storm building behind a silent horizon, subtle enough to ignore at first, then undeniable, then terrifying. It began with Father's tone, the way he started addressing me, not as his son, but as the future bearer of our line. At first, I thought it was simply a ceremonial phrase, something families like ours inherited along with wealth and tradition. But soon, the phrase took root in every conversation. My studies, my duties, my behavior, even my friendships were evaluated through this lens, as if my entire existence were narrowing into a single point of purpose I could not yet see. My sister changed again during this time. The quietness that had settled on her years before now deepened into something weightier, almost oppressive. She avoided eye contact, avoided rooms where father stayed too long, avoided conversations that might reveal her fear. I noticed her praying more often, not in the way we had been taught, reciting memorized phrases with precision, but with a trembling in her hands, as if she were begging for something she could not speak aloud. Sometimes I found her sitting alone in the family garden after sunset, her body curled inward, her face hidden behind her veil. Once, I approached her gently and asked if she was all right. She looked up at me with eyes that held storms. "Qasim," she whispered, "some truths come too early, and some come far too late." Then she stood and walked away before I could understand what she meant. The palace itself seemed to shift in atmosphere. Rooms that once felt spacious now felt heavy. Corridors echoed differently. Every sound stretched, magnified, as if the building itself were holding its breath. Servants moved more cautiously. Guards observed us with unfamiliar intensity. Even the daily call to prayer, once a familiar rhythm, now sounded like a reminder of duties that no longer brought comfort. I began to sense that something was being prepared behind the scenes, something enormous, something that involved me deeply, though no one had spoken of it openly. That uneasy knowing grew each time. Father summoned me for what he called lessons in legacy. These meetings took place in his private study, a massive room lined with ancient manuscripts, maps of lineage, and paintings of ancestors whose stern faces looked as though they were judging my very breath. He spoke of inheritance, of purity, of strength. He quoted scholars obscure enough that even I, despite years of study, had never heard of them. He showed me genealogical charts that traced our family back for centuries, explaining how strategic unions had preserved our line untainted. I listened with the respect drilled into me since childhood, but inside, something unsettled twisted tighter with every word. Around this time, Father also began speaking to me about my sacred responsibility. That phrase echoed in my mind long after our conversations ended. Responsibility for what? Leadership? Marriage? The future of the kingdom? Every possibility I imagined felt heavy, but not horrifying, not yet. Then came the morning that changed everything. The throne room was unusually quiet that day. I remember the echo of my footsteps against marble, the coldness of the air-conditioned hall contrasting with the heat burning inside my chest. Father sat on the elevated seat reserved for royal decrees, dressed in ceremonial white, the kind he wore only for decisions of profound importance. Beside him sat my sister, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her lips pressed into a thin, pale line. When Father began to speak, his voice was calm, almost gentle, too gentle. And then he said the words that felt like a blade sliding through my ribs. "Qasim, the time has come for you to fulfill the sacred duty of our ancestors. You will marry your sister." The room tilted. My mind screamed without making a sound. I stared at him, waiting for him to correct himself, to laugh, to reveal that this was some kind of test or metaphor. But his expression did not change. My sister did not lift her eyes. And in that instant, I understood everything, her sadness, her withdrawal, her brokenness. My vision blurred at the edges. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. The air felt too thin, as if the room were shrinking around me. I remember struggling to swallow, my throat tight and dry. I could not speak, not because I agreed, but because the part of me capable of forming words had collapsed under the weight of what I'd been told. Father continued speaking, explaining the historical precedent, the holy purpose, the necessity of preserving the royal line. He spoke with pride, conviction, righteousness, words that used to inspire me but now felt twisted, poisoned. I glanced at my sister, praying she would object, shake her head, refuse, but she remained silent, her stillness more painful than any scream could have been. When I finally found my voice, it emerged small, fractured. "Father, this cannot be right." But he simply placed a firm hand on my shoulder and said, "A prince does what must be done. Honor is not a choice, it is a legacy." Honor. That word suddenly tasted bitter. From that day, everything spiraled. Plans began immediately. Discussions with religious officials, legal documentation drafted, guests quietly informed, seamstresses preparing ceremonial garments. The palace moved with frightening efficiency, while inside me, dread grew like a storm that had nowhere to break. For 3 days, I drifted through the halls like a man underwater. I could hear conversations around me, but the words reached me distorted, muffled by panic. Food lost flavor, sleep refused to come. My thoughts spun endlessly between fear, disbelief, and a desperate wish to simply not exist. I tried seeking help. I went to the palace imam, my religious instructor since childhood. I asked not directly, but carefully, cautiously, whether such a union was truly permissible. He smiled, quoting ancient scholars who saw no fault in preserving bloodlines, praising father's wisdom, reminding me that obedience to one's father was obedience to God. His approval felt like a door slamming shut. I spent hours in father's library searching through religious texts, hoping to find one passage that would forbid this fate. But every text I touched seemed either silent or twisted in support of father's view. The religion I had believed would guide my morality now felt like it had turned against me. My sister and I spoke quietly whenever we found a moment alone. Her voice trembled as she admitted she had known about the marriage for months. She had cried until she had no tears left. She told me she had begged God for some escape, but none had come. We were 2 prisoners locked inside a palace full of gold. By the end of that week, one truth crystallized inside me with unbearable clarity. I was utterly trapped. Every door closed. Every advisor loyal to father. Every law aligned against us. Every prayer unanswered. And the God I had prayed to all my life felt impossibly far away. The days leading up to the engagement announcement felt like walking toward an execution disguised as a celebration. Every hallway I stepped through seemed narrower than the day before. The palace, once a place of familiarity, now felt like an elaborate trap designed to suffocate me slowly. Servants whispered, not out of cruelty, but because they sensed the tension hanging in the air. I could feel their eyes lingering on me the same way one watches a wounded animal, pitying, helpless, and afraid to intervene. My own body started to betray me. Sleep deserted me entirely. Night after night, I lay awake staring at the geometric patterns carved into the ceiling above my bed, tracing the same shapes until they twisted into something grotesque. My heart pounded even in silence. My hands trembled without warning. Sometimes, a wave of nausea would rise so suddenly that I had to grip the edge of the marble sink and breathe slowly, trying to keep myself from collapsing. I was 28 years old, a prince born into privilege and power, yet I felt like a child trapped in a nightmare I could not wake from. On the 3rd night, after another failed attempt at sleep, I walked into the private mosque attached to my chambers. The room was quiet, lit only by a faint glow from the lanterns along the wall. I knelt on the prayer rug, the silk fibers soft beneath my palms. I bowed my head, reciting words I had known since childhood, words I once believed had the power to reach heaven. But that night, they fell flat, collapsing into the silence around me like ashes. I pressed my forehead to the rug and whispered, "God, why would you allow this? What am I supposed to do?" But there was nothing, no comfort, no clarity, not even the illusion of peace, just the hollow echo of my own breath. The next morning brought the breaking point I had tried desperately to avoid. Father summoned me to the throne room for a final review of the ceremony details. The moment I entered, I knew something inside me was about to shatter. The decorations were already being arranged, golden fabrics draped across the pillars, arrangements of white roses symbolizing purity placed along the edges, and an ornate seat positioned where my sister and I would stand to receive the blessing. Seeing those preparations made everything horrifyingly real. My father stood near the center, speaking with advisors. When he saw me, he smiled, a smile filled with pride, satisfaction, certainty. "Qasim," he said, placing a hand on my shoulder, "this union will secure our family's future. Our ancestors would be proud." His hand felt heavy, like iron. I wanted to speak. I want to protest, to scream, to tell him he was destroying us. But the words stuck in my throat, suffocating me from the inside. My chest tightened as if bound by ropes. My vision blurred. I felt the room spinning, and for a moment I thought I might collapse right there on the marble floor. My sister entered quietly, her veil covering most of her face, but I saw her eyes red, swollen, hollow. She stood beside me, and though she didn't touch me, her presence radiated despair. This was not obedience. It was surrender. A surrender born not of faith, but of helplessness. That was when something inside me snapped. I stepped away from Father, unable to hide the tremor in my voice. "I cannot do this," I said. The words tasted like blood. "This is wrong." The room fell silent. Father turned toward me slowly, his expression unchanged. "Wrong?" he repeated, as if testing the unfamiliar shape of the word. "What is wrong is to defy divine order. What is wrong is to question the duty God himself has placed upon you." My breathing grew ragged. God would not ask this of us. His eyes hardened. "Then you know nothing of God." The shame, the fear, the pressure everything I had kept buried for years surged upward like water breaking through a dam. My knees weakened. I stumbled backward, gripping the edge of a pillar to keep myself upright. I felt as though the room were closing in, the air thinning, the walls pulsing with heat. My sister reached out as if to steady me, but she pulled her hand back before Father could notice. I whispered, barely audible even to myself, "I can't do this, I can't." For the first time in my life, I felt utterly abandoned, not just by my father, not just by my faith, but by the very God I had spent decades trying to serve. I stepped out of the throne room, my breath breaking into sharp fragments, my vision clouding. I walked until I found myself alone in a deserted corridor, the silence pressing against my ears. I slid down the wall, my back hitting the cold marble, and buried my face in my hands. "God," I whispered, voice breaking, "if you are real, if you see me, where are you?" That was my lowest moment, the dark valley before the miracle, the final cry before heaven responded. In the days that followed my breaking point, I lived in a strange twilight between fear and numbness, too exhausted to fight, too horrified to accept. I went through motions like a sleepwalker, drifting from room to room, barely aware of my own footsteps. And yet, beneath the despair, a quiet ache kept rising inside me, something like a whisper that refused to be silenced. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just reciting prayers, I was searching for something, anything, even the smallest ray of hope. It was during one of those sleepless nights that the first seed of change appeared, quietly, almost accidentally, as though heaven had decided to slip a crack of light into my darkness without warning. I had retreated to my private study, one of the few rooms in the palace where I could be alone without interruption. Usually it brought comfort, filled with shelves of leather-bound texts, polished wood, and the faint smell of old paper. But that night, even the familiar felt unfamiliar. The air felt heavy, and my hands shook as I attempted once again to read religious commentaries, hoping for an answer that refused to come. I opened book after book, collections of rulings, centuries-old legal opinions, theological treatises, searching for something that might contradict my father's decree, something that would give me permission to resist, something that would give me my life back. But page after page offered nothing. Every line felt like a door slamming shut. My chest tightened again. I pressed my palms against my eyes, trying to hold myself together. "There must be something," I whispered into the empty room. "There must be a way." That was when I heard a soft knock at the door. It wasn't loud, not urgent, just a gentle, hesitant tapping. I quickly wiped my face, straightened my posture, and opened the door, expecting a guard or a servant delivering a message from Father. Instead, it was an older steward, a man who had worked for my family longer than I had been alive. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, always moving with quiet respect. But this time, he looked directly at me, his eyes filled with something I hadn't seen in anyone else for weeks. Concern. Human concern. "Your Highness," he whispered, "forgive me, but you look unwell. May I bring you something to drink?" I nodded, unable to form words. When he returned minutes later with a tray of tea, he lingered longer than usual. His eyes shifted toward the stack of books scattered across my desk, and something in his expression softened. He set the tray down, then reached into the pocket of his robe. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "the answers we seek are not found where we expect them." Before I could respond, he placed a small object on the corner of my desk, a simple USB drive, plain, silver, unremarkable. Then he bowed and left without another word. At first, I stared at the drive without touching it. A strange mix of fear and curiosity rose in me. Why had he given it to me? What was on it? Why had he been so careful, so secretive? After several minutes, I connected it to my laptop. A single folder appeared. Inside it, videos, dozens of them. Titles in English and Arabic. Some labeled testimonies, others questions Islam cannot answer. And one video simply titled, "Who is Jesus?" My heart thudded in my chest. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the mouse. I had been taught all my life to fear this, to avoid anything linked to Christianity, to reject it before even hearing it. But fear had already failed me. Religion had already failed me. My father had already failed me. And something inside me, something small, trembling, barely alive, nudged me forward. I clicked on "Who is Jesus?" The video opened with a verse I had heard before, vaguely, distantly, in dismissive teachings. "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." But hearing it now, spoken gently, directly into the darkness of my room, it pierced through me like light breaking into a sealed cave. Weary, burdened, rest. 3 words that wrapped perfectly around the state of my soul. The man in the video spoke of Jesus not as a distant prophet, not as a figure to fear, but as a person, someone who saw people trapped in suffering, someone who touched the rejected, someone who healed the brokenhearted, someone who might see me. I leaned closer, unable to look away. My hands grew warm, my breath slowed. For the first time in months, my body wasn't shaking. The speaker continued, "Jesus does not demand perfection. He does not enslave with ritual. He calls gently, offering rest to those drowning in their own pain." Drowning. Yes, that was exactly what I was. It felt as though someone had reached into the deepest part of me and spoken directly into the wound I had been hiding for years. I clicked on another video, this one a testimony from a man who had grown up in a strict religious environment. He spoke of fear, pressure, rules, expectations, and then he spoke of a moment when he cried out in desperation and Jesus answered him. His voice trembled as he said, "I didn't find Jesus, Jesus found me." Something inside me broke open at those words. Could such a thing be possible? Could the God I had believed to be distant be near? Could he have seen my tears in the throne room? Could he have heard the whispered cry in the corridor? And the most dangerous question of all, could he care? That night, for the first time ever, I whispered the name Jesus into the silence, not as a curse, not as a forbidden topic, but as a question, a longing. "Jesus, if you're real, show me." I didn't expect an answer, but heaven had already begun to move. In the nights that followed my first whispered prayer to Jesus, something in the atmosphere around me began to shift so subtly at first that I wondered if it was only my imagination. Yet the change wasn't external. It was inside me, like someone had opened a window in a room I didn't realize had been sealed for years. I found myself returning to the laptop every night, waiting until the palace corridors grew silent and the guards changed shifts. With trembling hands, I watched testimonies, sermons, explanations of scripture, things I had been taught to fear. And the more I listened, the more I felt something warm pushing back against the cold ache in my chest. One night, after hours of watching, I fell asleep at my desk, my cheek pressed against an open notebook filled with my frantic scribbles, questions, confessions, fears I didn't dare say out loud. When I woke, the room was dark except for the glow of the city lights slipping through the curtains. My body was stiff, my mind fogged, but my heart strangely calm. Calm in a way I hadn't felt since childhood, before pressure, before duty, before fear. I decided I needed air. It was past 3 in the morning when I stepped out onto my balcony. Riyadh stretched below me, a tapestry of gold and shadow. The warm desert breeze brushed against my face as I gripped the stone railing. For a moment, I simply breathed, letting the night wrap around me like a blanket. I whispered again, barely audible, Jesus, if you are there, I need you. The moment the words left my lips, something happened. The wind, which had been soft and wandering, suddenly stilled, not gradually, instantly, as if the entire desert held its breath. I straightened, my heart pounding. Then came the light. It didn't appear in the sky or shine from the city. It bloomed behind me, inside my room. A warm, golden radiance spilled onto the balcony floor, stretching toward my feet. It was not the harsh brightness of electricity. It was soft, living, pulsing with warmth like sunlight on water. My skin tingled, every hair rising as though charged with invisible electricity. I turned slowly. The room behind me looked transformed, bathed in a glow that had no earthly source, and in the center of it, standing with a stillness that felt impossibly powerful, was a figure, a man, not tall, not imposing, yet radiating a presence so overwhelming that my knees nearly buckled. His silhouette was clear, his clothing simple, but his face felt like looking into a truth my soul had always known but had never seen. Eyes filled with a depth of compassion that undid me. Not cold authority, not distant judgment, love, pure, unshielded, unexplainable love. My breath caught, my hands trembled violently. Time felt suspended, as though the entire universe had narrowed to this one impossible moment. When he spoke, the sound wasn't merely heard, it moved through me. A gentle resonance that vibrated in my bones, as if each word was being engraved into my heart. Qasim, just my name. And hearing it in his voice broke something inside me so suddenly I gasped. No one had spoken my name like that, not with affection, not with tenderness, not with understanding. It sounded like home. You are not alone. I covered my mouth with my hands as tears flooded my eyes. The air around him shimmered faintly, not like heat, but like light becoming brighter at its edges. I wanted to speak, but my voice disappeared under the weight of emotion pressing against my chest. He stepped forward, not walking, but simply closing the distance in a way that didn't obey natural movement. Still gentle, still calm. He raised his hand slightly, and though he didn't touch me, warmth washed over me as if his hand rested directly against my heart. I have seen your suffering, he said softly. Every moment you felt unseen, unheard, forgotten, I was there. A sob escaped me, raw and unrestrained. My legs gave out, and I fell to my knees on the balcony, tears dripping onto the stone. My body shook with years of unspoken fear, guilt, and confusion. I can't. I choked. I can't do this. I can't live like this anymore. His expression did not change, but the compassion in his eyes deepened, pulling me back from the edge of despair. You were never meant to live in chains? My breath faltered. Chains. Yes, that was what my life had become. Expectations, duty, fear, tradition. Chains disguised as honor. You are mine, he continued, his voice stronger now, filled with unshakable authority. Not theirs, not the world's. I have come to set you free. Something inside me shattered in the best way. A pressure I had carried for years cracked open, releasing a flood of emotion I didn't know how to contain. I bowed forward, my forehead touching the cold stone, my tears pooling beneath me. I don't know how to be free, I whispered. You don't need to know, he answered. You simply need to come. The warmth around me intensified, wrapping me like a cloak. My trembling slowed, my breathing softened. The panic that had lived in my chest for months evaporated as though someone had reached inside me and pulled it out by the root. Qasim, he said again, let me give you rest. Rest. The one thing I had begged for, prayed for, hungered for, and never found. I lifted my head slowly. Jesus, I whispered, the name trembling on my lips. I believe. Help me. At that moment, the light around him flared brighter, not blinding, but enveloping. I felt as though my soul were being washed clean, a warmth rushing through me like a river breaking through a dam. And then, as gently as he had appeared, the light softened, fading like sunrise, dissolving into morning. He did not walk away. He simply disappeared. But the peace he left behind stayed inside me, wider than my fear, deeper than any tradition, stronger than the chain that had bound me for decades. For the first time in my life, I felt truly, completely alive. In the days after that encounter, everything around me looked the same, yet nothing felt the same. The palace walls were unchanged, the guards moved with the same precision, the call to prayer echoed through the corridors as it always had, but inside me, something had shifted so profoundly that even the air tasted different. The fear that once tightened my chest had loosened, the despair that clouded my mind had thinned. I walked through the same golden cage, but now there was a door I could sense somewhere, even if I couldn't see it yet. Still, reality pressed in. The engagement ceremony was scheduled, invitations had been sent, the preparations intensified with every passing hour. My father's illness from stress seemed to have faded. He moved through the palace with more determination than ever, inspecting decorations, reviewing documents, ensuring that nothing stood in the way of the union he believed sacred. If he noticed my changed demeanor, my quiet confidence, the strange calm in my eyes, he dismissed it as resignation. But I was not resigning. I was waiting because Jesus had told me I belonged to him. And if that was true, then nothing, not tradition, not family, not fear, could imprison me forever. The first sign came unexpectedly. 2 days before the ceremony, a series of violent sandstorms struck our region, storms so sudden and severe that meteorologists on television struggled to explain them. Visibility dropped to nearly zero. The palace windows shook with the force of the wind. Sand beat against the glass like 1,000 desperate fists. Outdoor preparations were halted, decorations were torn apart, invitations had to be recalled. Father was furious. He called it an attack from the enemy, a test of faith. I silently wondered if it was the opposite, a divine interruption, but that was just the beginning. On the morning of the engagement announcement, I awoke before dawn with a strange stillness in my chest. Not fear, anticipation. I knelt beside my bed and prayed in the name of Jesus, openly, freely, without the shame or hesitation that once bound my tongue. Lord, I whispered, you told me I am yours. I surrender this day to you. I felt a warmth settle on my shoulders, as if unseen hands had rested there. At 10:15 a.m., the palace physician rushed through the halls. I heard hurried voices, frantic footsteps, confusion. My father had collapsed inside the throne room, sharp chest pain, difficulty breathing, sudden fever. He was conscious but unable to stand. The doctor ordered immediate bed rest and complete cancellation of the ceremony until further notice. I stood outside the room, stunned. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't luck. This wasn't chance. This was intervention. Barely half an hour later, as the palace scrambled to rearrange schedules, another message arrived. The religious leader selected to bless our union had been called away due to a family emergency. His mother had suffered a heart attack. He would be unavailable indefinitely. A second blow to the ceremony, another impossibility, another barrier placed between us and destruction. But God wasn't finished. At 12:30 p.m., as the storm winds raged louder, my sister received a phone call that left her frozen in place. She came to my room, trembling not with fear, but disbelief. Oxford University called, she whispered. They offered me a full scholarship, immediate admission. They said a space opened by chance this morning. They need me in London within 48 hours or the offer expires. I felt tears rising in my eyes, not from panic this time, from awe. My sister, who had been resigned to a lifetime of oppression, now held in her hands a door to a different world, a door opened not by human generosity, but by divine orchestration. You have to go, I told her. My voice shook. This is God. This is Jesus. He's rescuing you. She sank into my arms and cried, not with sorrow, but with the relief of a bird finding its wings. The palace scrambled again. Father, bedridden and disoriented from fever, could hardly protest. He mumbled objections, but the doctor insisted she leave before travel restrictions tightened due to the storm. Within 24 hours, she was on a flight to London. Our chains were breaking, one link at a time. But my escape would come differently. 3 days later, Father's condition worsened. Advisors and high-ranking officials filled the palace with tension. In the middle of this chaos, a business associate approached me quietly and said father had intended for me to attend an investment conference in Dubai in his place. The paperwork was already approved. All that remained was my signature. I knew instantly this was the doorway Jesus had promised. That night, I knelt one last time in my darkened room and whispered, Lord, lead my steps. At dawn, I boarded the private jet to Dubai. No guards questioned me. No authority stopped me. No suspicion lingered. The storm had created such disarray that I passed through layers of oversight unnoticed. When the wheels lifted off the runway, I felt as though chains snapped from my wrists. In Dubai, far from the eyes of those who controlled my fate, I contacted a Christian organization specializing in protecting converts fleeing persecution. They arranged safe housing, legal counsel, and asylum procedures with breathtaking precision, as though every piece had been prepared in advance. And in my heart, I heard again the voice that had met me on my balcony, You are mine. Jesus had not only seen me, he had delivered me. Life after my escape did not begin with triumph. It began with silence. A small, modest apartment in a city where no one knew my name, no one bowed when I entered, no guards lined the hallways, no echo of authority followed my steps. For the first time in my life, I woke up not to the call of duty, but to the quiet, unfamiliar sound of my own breathing. Freedom, I discovered, is not loud. It whispers. Every morning, sunlight filtered through thin curtains instead of crystal chandeliers. I made my own meals. I washed my own clothes. I walked streets where I was just another face in the crowd. And yet, instead of feeling diminished, I felt alive. Every small task felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I never knew I had lost. I spent hours reading scripture slowly, hungrily, letting every verse sink deep into the places where fear once lived. When I reached the words, "If the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed," tears streamed down my face, because for the first time, I understood the meaning of freedom, not political freedom, not social freedom, but freedom of the soul, the kind no kingdom can give, the kind no tradition can take. My sister and I spoke often. Her voice through the phone sounded lighter than I had ever heard, as though London's rain had washed the sorrow from her bones. She told me she had surrendered her life to Jesus during her flight, a quiet, trembling prayer at 30,000 feet, where she felt God closer than she had ever felt on the ground. She joined a Christian community at her university, and for the first time in years, she laughed. Not politely, not cautiously, she laughed like someone who had stepped out of the grave. Jesus had not just rescued us, he had resurrected us. Months later, after my asylum was approved, I began attending a small church that welcomed me with no expectation, no curiosity about my past, no need to impress anyone. They saw me not as a former prince, not as someone escaping controversy, but as a brother in Christ. I remember standing in the sanctuary during worship, my hands trembling as voices around me rose in unison, not to please a ruler, not to follow tradition, but to praise a Savior who had given everything for us. That was the first time I ever felt truly part of a family. Today, my life looks nothing like the one I was born into. I no longer walk through palaces. I no longer wear silk robes or dine with officials. I no longer measure my worth by lineage, obedience, or perfection. Instead, I measure it by grace. I spend my days sharing my story with others who live under the weight I once carried, people trapped by fear, crushed by expectations, suffocated by systems they cannot escape. I tell them about the night Jesus stepped into my darkness. I tell them about the voice that called me mine. I tell them that the God who parted the sea for Moses, who shut the lions' mouths for Daniel, who broke my chains in a palace across the world, is the same God who sees them now. Sometimes I look back at the life I left behind, the wealth, the status, the inheritance, and I feel no loss, none at all, because I traded a kingdom of sand for a kingdom that cannot be shaken. I lost a title, but I gained an identity. I lost the approval of men, but I gained the love of God. And if I were asked to choose again, I would choose Jesus every single time. If you are listening to my story right now, I want to ask you something. What chains are holding your soul? What fears whisper that you will never be free? What expectations have wrapped themselves around your heart until you can barely breathe? Jesus can break them. If he could reach a prince locked inside a golden prison, he can reach you wherever you are, whatever you face, whatever darkness surrounds you. If you need prayer, write in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from. You are not alone. And if this testimony touched your heart, subscribe for more stories of hope, because Jesus is still saving, still healing, still finding those who cry out to him in the dark. He found me, and he can find you too.